So this is going to be a quick technical introduction to this rather obscure tool, which is called a peening machine, which is taken from the German where it originates, the German being Dengelapparat, being Dengel peening and Apparat apparatus, and it is very specifically designed to work on the Continental style scything blade, and it works with simple leverage, working two jaws to compress and pull out the edge of the blade, which is done typically in England with other tools at the moment. And this is one which I picked up when I was living in Germany, where it's a lot more common. They're not typical in the UK because our tradition, the English tradition of blades, you don't do peening. And this machine, which is manufactured by an Austrian company called Schweiger Fulpmes or something like that, they're roughly £250 plus or minus, depending on when you buy it and the route to purchase it, including import tax and some complicated bits. So they're quite expensive and they really prove themselves in terms of their effectiveness and their speed over other ways of doing peening when you are doing a lot of blades. So if you're a teacher, if you are running supporting a whole bunch of volunteers doing conservation work, and you're doing either multiple blades, or you're needing to peen in an area where the noise from the striking of traditional peening will bother your neighbours. The advantages of this machine are that it is very quiet, it works very effectively, it's much quicker than the other hammer methods of peening, and it produces a very clean, very accurate peen, incredibly clean. I'll show you in a moment. Lastly, a really significant factor for quite a few people I'm talking to is the physical involvement of hammer peening. It really involves the wrist, the hands, a lot of repetitive striking motion. Whereas this, the movement is a pushing down on the lever with a bit of resistance, but it is a lot easier to do. Also because hammer peening takes a lot longer, so I can do a blade on this in a few minutes sometimes if I'm just doing one line of peening, and that allows me to the peening process to become effortless rather than a major undertaking. So as to the structure and the function of it, it's made up of the lever, which is connected to the pair of black jaws here, and the black jaws, the fundamental way it works is by there being a lot of tension. These two jaws are compressed against each other, so when the blade is fed into the two jaws, these jaws rotate and grab onto the edge of the blade, and then as they rotate against each other, that edge gets squished and drawn out as well, pulled out. So the blade is being fed in as you would use it on a scythe, and the difference is the lower jaw here is slightly flatter. It still has a gentle curve, but it's essentially flat, and the top jaw has a significant radius to it. So it's that radiusing there which is creating the concavity in our blade. And so that's in effect our anvil and our cross-peen hammer. So the blade is fed in and grabbed and rotated to the point that you feel the resistance of the handle, and the resistance is the point where you're starting to affect the shape of the metal of the blade. So within the process, the three variables that we have that we can affect or change are how we're feeding the blade in, sort of the not really the angle, but the feed of the blade into the jaws, We also, of course, have the handle, which is where, or the lever, where we're adjusting the exact pressure that we're exerting on the blade at that point. So the other really key part that we can adjust is this wedge here. So this silver bar is a tapered wedge, and what that does is it adjusts what I call the preload, so the amount of pre-developed pressure between the two jaws. And the wedge works on like an anvil, or the base which this jaw is sitting on. So as I knock the wedge in, you can tell sort of the amount of pressure, because it also adjusts the jaws and the handle. So I'll show you, as the wedge is being struck in, this handle rises up to the point where if the lever is parallel, that is a huge amount of preload or pre-pressure, and if you feed the blade in at this point, you'll be hitting a really fine edge peen and probably over peening. But if the lever is sitting down here, you've got hardly any room to actually create any movement, and nothing will happen. So in terms of the relationship between the use of the lever and the wedge, what's happening is the lever is giving us our power, so really the amount that the amount of pressure and the amount of peen that is happening, but the wedge affects the pressure or the slack. So if there is more slack in the jaws, what it does is it allows the blade to be fed in more to the jaws before that rolling, before the rolling of the jaws starts adding pressure and creating the peen. So a slacker position will allow the peen to be further away from the edge, and as that wedge is knocked in and more preload occurs, then the pressure is starting to occur much closer to the edge. So depending on how much I need to peen this blade, I will change how much the wedge is in to allow me to get just a nice little edge peen and really grab the very, very edge of it, or to roll more deeper in to start shifting a bigger body of material. Okay, so for an example on this section of the blade, it needs sort of a peen a little bit further back and then an edge peen. So to do this, like a second line or a line of peen slightly deeper in, I want the jaws to be able to reach further in. So I've got the settings slacked off a little bit. I'm maybe going to drop the handle slightly to that position. We'll see if that works or not. And then what I'm going to do is lift the handle back up, which opens the jaws and means that I can set or push the blade, that leading edge of the blade, into the jaws, so that I have a larger range of motion. I've got more. The jaws can close and travel further over the depth of the blade, and that's one of the key techniques I use, is choosing whether I'm giving more option for the jaws to roll over the blade, or if I'm putting the blade in with the handle already slightly pressured, which will mean that the pressure through the jaws is going to hit the blade earlier on. So with that open and the blade tucked straight in, right into the back of the jaws, we'll see what happens and see the kind of pressure needed. And there we've got the very typical oblong. So it's made an oblong of about 20 millimeters long and 3-4 millimeters, no, a bit more, yeah, 4 millimeters wide. And then for the next impact or next movement, I can move that half. I usually move it about half the distance of the oblong, which is about 10 mil. So I can hit the blade 10 mil at a time, opening the jaws, putting the blade in, and give it a pressure. And I can, when I'm in the rhythm, I can get a fairly fast repetition. I'm pushing fairly hard on the handle. I'm really making the jaws work because I want to get quite a lot of movement there, as in I'm moving quite a lot of metal. And we'll see what that looks like. So just then I've managed to work about 10 centimetres of the blade, and it's starting to create that curved, that concave surface. Now if I can do the whole blade like that, and to move on to the next part, which is hitting closer to the front leading edge of the blade, I'm going to strike the wedge in a bit more. Let's see how that works. And now instead of, well, let's try it with opening the jaws up again. There's not so much movement I get now because the handle is higher. Sometimes there's particular movements where there is this pinging sound. So I lied when I said it's always silent. Okay, so having done that bit with this setting, then it's really developing and creating the nice form, and you can see I've got about 5 centimetres there, and I'm going to go over and drive the wedge in again and get the jaws biting on the very edge, and just pull that out. Everything's falling off. So now for the very edge peen, instead of opening the jaws up and pulling the handle up to push the blade in, I'm going to put a little bit of pressure, so I'm going to increase the preload on the jaws by pushing the handle down slightly, and that means that the moment the blade is being tucked into the jaws, that the jaws are going to really hit sort of full pressure right on the edge. I can feel it rolling on, and I can also really gauge with the pressure on the lever what kind of work I'm getting it to do. So there's my fully peened bevel, and that's got a really nice curve to it, feels very smooth. You can see how much it's drawn and pulled the blade out in comparison to this bit where I haven't touched it yet. And if we look at the very edge, right edge on, there's no visible light coming off the edge. It's an incredibly fine edge. So let's run that down a little bit. So here we go, that section here, we've done 3 passes now, and that is super effective. It's really clean. You can hardly see any transition between the different strikes or the different impacts we've done on it, with about 10 millimeters being worked every time. It's a little bit less when you're doing the very edge, as less of the blade is being hit by the jaws. And that's maybe something useful to say. When we did that very first strike, then there was an oblong, and that's because the jaws are not only curved in this dimension, but they have a very slight curve on them this way too, just like the anvils that we're used to, and most bar peen hammers. So that establishes that oblong. So here's an old blade that's not in awful condition, but it definitely needs a good peen. So I'm going to run it through and see how long it takes me to do the different stages working over this whole blade, which is a 75 centimetre. So. Okay, so that's one full peen which has hit a significant part of it, and I'm now going to tighten up the wedge and move on to sort of like a mid part. Probably about there. Okay, second full length done, and that's starting to look really good. If I'm taking this to do like a proper grass or hay blade, then I want to pull out that very edge again. So I'm going to do a third line now and see if I can get that wave happening. There's already it is starting to happen a little bit. We can see some movement in there. That would be very much good enough for a lot of stuff. But for this demonstration, let's also do a final peen. Okay, there we are, and that feels pretty good. And let's see about the ripple. Yeah, we've very easily got a ripple going there, and so with a very bit of light stonework, that already feels incredibly sharp. With a light bit of stonework, you'll barely have to take much off at all to get that to a very fine edge and working really nicely. So here's our blade, which we've done 3 full passes on a 75 blade, and that took between 7 and 8 minutes to do this complete blade. On a shorter blade, then that might just be a couple of minutes, especially if you're only having to do 1 pass. So it's pretty effective and pretty quick, and from the effort, I'm not going to lie, like that was, like I could feel my body, I can feel my shoulder in that effort of repeatedly pushing the handle down. So it's not effortless, it requires physical exertion. So I think a concerted amount like that, doing 3 passes quite quickly straight after each other, definitely requires something from the body, but there's very little in the wrist, it's a lot more in the shoulder and the upper body. And as to the handle here, there's also an option from the same company where you replace this handle, the lever section, with a bar of metal which becomes a foot lever, so it hangs much lower down, and you're doing a larger rocking motion with your foot, freeing up both hands to be able to do the control of the blade, which I'd really like to get, and I think would make it an even more ergonomic and effective or easy machine to use. I also noticed that when I'm balancing the blade with one hand here, it does require some stress or some tension in the hand to be able to maintain the blade in the right place. And the other things about maintenance, it's neat to have grease or oil on these 3 moving parts, and then where the 2 jaws bear on this superstructure here, then I've got a bit of grease on those bearing surfaces, but that's about it. The other thing which I find happens quite frequently, or which I'm getting used to happening, is when you're tapping the wedge in, you're creating a lot of pressure, so there's a lot of resistance, but when you're tapping the wedge back out, it's very easy to shoot the wedge out, or for the wedge to disappear, and then the jaws can fall back and come out of the places where they're actually designed to be, and it can be a bit of a fiddle getting them back in. So I'm really learning not to drop the wedge out, as it's a bit of a faff, but I'm also learning how to get the jaws back in the right way. I've also lost the wedge and this little anvil, or not the anvil, this part here. I've lost those before, or they've dropped out when I've been transporting it, so be aware of their losability as well. But it is possible to put them in with just a little bit of fiddling, and to make sure that you've especially located this top the top bearing surface in the right part of this this section of the superstructure. And as you've seen, it also comes with this thing which you can take off as well for transport, but is really useful, especially if you're just using the lever the hand lever rather than the foot lever. It really allows support of the blade, even the longer ones. So here's a 90 centimetre blade, and so when I'm working on the very tip, it's supported a good halfway out. And the other thing that comes up occasionally is this pinging that happens when the blade is being compressed by the jaws, and you get this sharp percussive sound. And I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but it's just the pressure on the blade pushing the blade out a little bit, sort of trying to eject it from the jaws. That largely happens when you have quite a steep bevel, but it happens in other circumstances. Sometimes it's really regular, sometimes it only happens really occasionally. It can be a bit of a jolt. Nothing's happening wrong, nothing's breaking, the blade isn't breaking, the blade isn't cracking. It's all fine. It's just the jaws rearranging themselves on the metal when they're under so much stress. So it's fine, it's just a bit annoying. So there it is, the peening machine from Schweiger. It's superb, it's completely changed my relationship to peening. I'm not sponsored by them, I just bought it and it is such a significant difference. I highly recommend it, especially if you're doing multiple blades or you find peening physically difficult. It's fantastic.